Shavua Tov, good morning. This week is the Parsha of Vayeitzei. Okay. In this week's Parsha, we learn about how Yaakov, he leaves Beersheva, he goes to Haran, and he there marries Rachel and Leah, and they have 11 of the 12 Shvatim there in Haran with Zilpah and Bilhah, the maidservants. Today I'm going to discuss one of the Shvatim whose name was Zvulun. Zvulun was the 6th of the 12 tribes that were born. And the Torah tells us that when Zvulun was born, his mother Leah says, she was the one that gave the names for the Shvatim. She says, "Hapam yizbaleni ishi." Now that I've given birth to this child, yizbaleni, he will make his permanent and main residence with me. The word Yizbaleni has the etymology of Zvul, Zvul meaning a permanent dwelling place. The reason for that is because the imahos, the matriarchs, they were prophetesses. They all had a special divine inspiration. And they knew that Yaakov was destined to have 12 sons, the 12 Shvatim, which would be the foundation of the Bnei Yisrael, of the future Jewish nation. And since Yaakov was destined to marry the 4 wives and 2 sisters, Leah and Rachel, so therefore they knew that each one would have a certain amount of children with Yaakov. So Leah, being that she wasn't the favored wife, that was Rachel, now that she had Zvulun, she thought to herself, this is the 6th child that I've had with my husband, and now I know that at least 50% came from me. And since there were other children from Bilhah, Zilpah, and Rachel, she knew that Yaakov will see me as the permanent place where he will dwell. And thus the name Zvulun, Yizbaleni, from the word Zvul. We find when Shlomo HaMelech built the first Beis HaMikdash, after many, many years where the Shekhinah, the divine presence, rested in the Mishkan, in the temporary portable temple, there was a final permanent resting place for the Shekhinah in the temple, in the Beis HaMikdash. And he says that I built Beis Zvul Lach, I've built a dwelling place for you, where here he implies that the Zvul, the dwelling place, was permanent. The truth is, though, albeit that the name Zvulun has this meaning of the permanent dwelling place for Hashem, for Yaakov, nevertheless, that is only in relation to Leah. That is to say, Leah is calling Zvulun the name Zvulun because Yizbaleni Ishi, now my husband will dwell with me on a permanent basis. That has nothing to do with the child himself. But the reality is, we know, the Arizal tells us that the name that parents give to their children is not random. It's something that is given to them by divine inspiration. It's a form of prophecy, that the name that is given to the child corresponds and aligns with the spiritual root and source of each person. So, in other words, the name of a person reflects the innate chemistry and composition of a person, and therefore the parents, by naming the child, they are able to reveal and through a person's name, a person actually receives the vitality, the spiritual energy needed, corresponding to from their source to through their name. It is drawn down here into the physical world. And this is certainly the case when we talk about the Emos, when we talk about our matriarchs who were prophetesses, as we mentioned before. They knew how many children that they would have. And in other instances, we know that they were all Nevios. And therefore, if they gave a name to their child, it wasn't just something that there was an event. She said that now Zvulun, I'm going to live with my husband permanently, so the name has nothing to do with the child. It's not just because Zvulun was number 6, we say that Zvulun will be called Zvulun. There's something innate, there's something inherent to the character and the chemistry, the makeup of Zvulun, and that's why his name is Zvulun. So here we have a question. This is the question. It's based on a talk of the Rebbe, and he asks, if Zvulun is now to be, as we mentioned, Zvulun which is the root word of Zvul, which means permanent resting place. So we're saying that Yaakov's main place will be in Zvulun. But Zvulun was a merchant. We know that in the Parsha of Vayeitzei, when Yaakov, he gives the blessings to all of his children, he says, Zvulun l'choif yamim yishkain. Zvulun will be a merchant who will live on the sea coast. And the commentators explain he was constantly traveling, and he was traveling around with the ships and the boats. So he was always moving around because he was engaged in commerce. Yaakov was, as we learned in the Parsha of Toldos, Yaakov was Yoshev Oyalim. He would sit in the tents of Torah study and the tents of Shem and Aver. Torah was his life. So how do we understand that Yaakov's main and primary residence will be with Zvulun, which Zvulun, his whole life was that of commerce and enterprise and business. Now, we find another place in the Torah where it talks about Zvulun, and that is in the end of the Parsha of Vayeitzei Bracha. In the Parsha of Vayeitzei Bracha, when Moshe Rabbeinu also blesses all the tribes, and he says, when it comes to Zvulun, he says Smach Zvulun b'tzeisecha v'yisachar ba'oyalecha. In one verse, there is a blessing for both the tribe of Zvulun and the shevet of Yisachar. However, in the sequence of the pasuk, first the bracha is Smach Zvulun b'tzeisecha, and then Yisachar ba'oyalecha. So we preface the tribe of Zvulun before Yisachar. And Rashi explains, why is that? Because there was a partnership, there was a deal over here. Zvulun would go out in business, and he would support Yisachar, who would study Torah the whole day. Because Yisachar was able to study due to the fact that he was being supported and financed by Zvulun, it is therefore that Zvulun takes precedence and in terms of in the chronology of the verse, Zvulun comes before Yisachar. So perhaps we could say that therefore we see there's a virtue, there's an advantage to Zvulun over Yisachar in the fact that he is mentioned first in the pasuk because he is the pillar, he is the support for the Torah study. However, that is not a sufficient enough an explanation to explain why Yaakov would make up his primary residence with Zvulun. At the end of the day, yes, those who support Torah have a special advantage and their merit and their schus. All the Torah study is taken as a credit, and there is a certain advantage to that. However, it still doesn't explain why would Yaakov's main residence, why would Yaakov's main place where he would dwell be with a place of commerce and business. And the truth is, the Rebbe points out that at the end of the day, this is not just a phenomenon that we find by Zvulun. We see this curiosity in the life of Yaakov himself. Because, as we mentioned before, Yaakov was Yoshev Oyalim. He was someone who studied Torah the entire day. Each time he was a very simple and pious person. Yet, when we look at the life of Yaakov, especially in this week's Torah portion, he was at the home of his father-in-law, the deceitful and cunning, sly Lavan for 20 years. And what did he do during those 20 years? He was an employee. He worked as a shepherd for Lavan day and night. And as we read in the end of the Parsha, he says, I worked in the snow, in the cold, in the frost. No matter what happened, 24 hours a day he was dedicated and devoted to Lavan. To the extent that in Maimonides, in Halacha, we read about the duties and obligations that an employee has towards his employer. One of the precedents and case studies for that is Yaakov, where we learn that an employee is not allowed to take off any time, and every second that they don't dedicate towards their employer is a form of theft. Yaakov, his complete and utter devotion, not even though he had his own business, he had his own flock of sheep that we learn about in the Parsha, he had to delegate that to his children, not to take away even one moment from his responsibilities to his employer. And other laws that we learn as well. In any case, Yaakov, if he was so consumed and so preoccupied with his duties towards Lavan and tending to his flock, his sheep and cattle and whatnot, clearly he did not have enough time to study Torah. It does say in our sages, our tradition tells us that Yaakov would, what would he do during those nights? He would say the Shir Hamalos, but it hardly allows for an immersive Torah study experience when you're busy working, and this was for an extended period of time, for 20 years. And nevertheless, he is in Haran, a place that is hostile to Hashem. As the word Haran, our sages teaches, comes from the word Charon Af, anger, a place that raises the ire and anger of Hashem, was a place that was antithetical to Hashem and his values. It is nevertheless in this space, it is in this arena where Yaakov does something quite amazing. The Torah says, Vayifrotz ha'ish ma'od ma'od, he became wildly successful. Ma'od ma'od, a double term, which means it was exceedingly so, not just in a physical sense, but also spiritually. He held up very well. Here in Haran, not in Beersheba, not in Eretz Yisrael, where he had all the spiritual infrastructure, was the chosen land. It is here, out in Haran, where Yaakov raises 11 of the 12 Shvatim, except Binyamin. Each and every one of them. As Yaakov was known as the Bechir Sheba'avos, he was the chosen, most supreme of the three Avos of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Yaakov was the greatest, because Mitasa Shlema, he had 12 children, each one followed in his path. Avram had a Yishmael, Yitzchak had an Esav, Yaakov, all 12 followed in his path. And where does that happen? Outside of Eretz Yisrael, and not just that, and during a time and period of his life that was exceedingly turbulent, turmoil. He was deceived in terms of his wife. He had to work many, many years, and he wasn't able to study Torah. And nevertheless, it is here that he raises the Shvatim, which is the foundation of the future Jewish nation. How do we understand that? You would think that perhaps it is in Beersheba, where Yaakov is immersed in Torah study his entire day. That is where he could set an example for his children. That's where he could be successful. No, it is in Haran, when he is working as an employee for somebody else, has not a moment for himself. That is where he sees his material and spiritual success. So it teaches us a very, very profound idea, how we are to view work, how we are to view engaging in this physical world. Because our sages teach us a fascinating concept. Tzadikim domim laboram. Our righteous sages, our righteous ancestors, they mimic their creator. Which means, if you want to understand how things work down here in this world, how the righteous operate, you have to understand how things work in the spiritual realms. Yaakov's main dira, Yaakov's main dwelling place, will parallel Hashem's dwelling place. So we thought, where would Yaakov's main dwelling place be? In a place of Torah, in a place of learning, a place of inspiration, not with Zevulun in a place where there's commerce and engaged in all kinds of material pursuits. So if we want to take a cue, we look at Hashem. Where does Hashem live? What is Hashem's dira? What is Hashem's dwelling place? Hashem does not, as one would think, want to dwell necessarily and specifically in the spiritual realms, with the angels, with the holy souls. No. Nisava Kadosh Baruch Hu Lias Lodir B'Tachtonim. Hashem wants to dwell down here in this physical world. That is the desire of Hashem. And thus, in every object, in every phenomenon in this world, there's an opportunity. There's a spiritual spark where Hashem wants each and every one of us to go out into the world, to transform, to extract the spark, the opportunity, the meaning of every experience, and elevate that to a holy and noble cause. So therefore, the tzaddikim work and operate in the same way. Their main dwelling place will not necessarily be in the realm of Torah. Yaakov, he sees where's his permanent dwelling. It is out there in the physical world. It is the businessman, the person who is rubbing shoulders every single day with not necessarily people who are studying Torah, but he's out there dealing with all kinds of people. But there is a purpose here, not just to be engaged in business for business sake. There is an ulterior motive. Whenever you deal in your business with honesty and integrity, when you take of your earnings and you give to tzedakah, so now what you're doing is you're taking this whole experience and elevating it to a higher purpose. There was a chassid of the Rebbe, Rabbi Meir Zeiler. This was after the Yom Kippur War, and the community in Israel was down, and they were going through difficult times, not just emotionally, but also financially. And his father-in-law came to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe suggested that you should open up business opportunities for these fellow Jews in Eretz Yisrael to help them. And he suggested that they had his father-in-law, David Deitch, had a textile company. He said you should open up a branch in Eretz Yisrael. And they thought it was crazy, it didn't make any sense, it wasn't viable, and everyone said not to do it. But nevertheless, it was given to his son-in-law, this Meir Zeiler, and nevertheless, he was trying, and it was something that was very, very difficult. Every door that they tried to knock on remained shut. And it was very, very difficult. Finally, the Rebbe said, you need to move there, move to Israel, and when you're on the ground, things will get better. And he talks about how everybody told them not to do it. It doesn't make any sense. But ultimately, with the Rebbe's brachas, they saw tremendous success. In fact, they began to spread out to other places. They took their textiles and went to Europe and went on these trade shows. And he talks about how one time he was in Europe, and he set up his little booth over there by these various fairs. And one of the challenges was that for these fairs would run from Wednesday till Sunday. And of course, Shabbos is one of the most important days for these fairs. But of course, it wasn't even a question for him, and he had to close down for Shabbos. But he was afraid that some people would come specifically on Shabbos and not know that he's closed on that time and not come earlier. So therefore, he put up a sign on a few hours before Shabbos saying that we're going to be closed on Shabbos. Like this, they'll see the sign, and if they wanted to come check him out, they would come then. And after this fair, he wrote into the Rebbe about the various activities that he's doing. And the Rebbe wrote back, one of the things that he wrote back to him was that instead of putting up the sign 2 hours before Shabbos that we're going to be closed, you should do it already on Wednesday. On Wednesday already you should write that we are closed. We are going to be closed for Shabbos. And on the face of it, it seems that the Rebbe was just saying, strategically it makes more sense. If you do it earlier, people on Wednesday or Thursday will know already to plan ahead, not to come on Shabbos, to come earlier, to come on Friday, to come on Thursday. But on a deeper level, what the Rebbe is really telling him is that you think you're going out here on business and you're going to make a profit and you're going to do well. That's not why Hashem sent you out here. You're actually here with your textiles. It's a form of a shluchas. There's a special mission that you're here. Already on Wednesday, you're telling people there's a concept called Shabbos. And Wednesday and Thursday, it's constantly on people's mind, and they think about it, and you talk about it. That is your shluchas. That is what your purpose is. So these people who are engaged in work, for them, they're going to places that those who study Torah, those who are engaged in prayer a whole day, that's very, very special, not to diminish it, and it's very, very important. However, if we are to bring about and materialize, actualize Hashem's vision, to have a dwelling place here in the lowest of realms, this means that we need to go out into the world and engage with the world and be able to transform, bring a light, bring a purpose and a meaning to every experience that we have. The Rebbe says, fascinatingly, that's why we find today that the majority of the Jewish community are not Torah, those who study Torah. Most people are engaged in business. It's not just a coincidence. It actually reflects the divine design. You need to have a core of people who study Torah, who have no worldly pressures and burdens and anxieties. But in order to advance the cause and to bring the world closer to a consciousness and appreciation of Hashem, to bring Mashiach, we need to have those who are engaged in the world of business, to be constantly out there in the world, extracting the sparks, redeeming every opportunity for something that is holy and meaningful. However, this is true, and in fact, the Rebbe brings in the Hayom Yom from the Rebbe Maharash that he once told one of his Hasidim, one of his followers, he said, I envy you. You go to various fairs and the marketplaces, and I see all of this, and I'm very jealous of you, because when you meet someone out on the street, you speak to them about an idea of Torah, you speak to them about, you give over an idea, you exchange something that's Torah related. You have opportunities. You see hashgacha pratis. You see divine providence. As we know that people who are out there in the world, they see God in a very tangible and a very real way. There's no, wow, this was my strategy, that's why I was successful. They see the hand of Hashem in everything that happens. They say, wow, this was amazing. They're able to see godliness. They're able to see providence in a way that no one else is able to. So this is true, and this is important. However, the big question here is, we see that at the end of the day, Yaakov, he had success in Haran. But if we look at Lavan, if we look at Zvulun, rather, we see an interesting paradox. Because on the one hand, his name, Zvulun, as we mentioned before, has the etymological root of Zvul, which means permanence, which means stability. It means that this person is has a certain consistency, there's a certain predictability. You know that when you say this is the permanent home, it's around, it's there. However, if you look at the life of Zvulun, he's always moving about, he's always on the run. He's out traveling, he's never in one place. It's the opposite of permanence and stability. So how do we reconcile the two? In fact, it would seem that the person who's studying Torah, the person who stays in one place, has a certain pattern, a certain predictability. That would seem to be more correct. Whereas Zvulun, he, on the one hand, his name connotes a certain stability, and yet his life seemed to be anything but. So here we come to a very fascinating perspective. What does it mean to have stability, to have permanency, to have peace, to have serenity in life? There are two perspectives. There are two kinds of peace. There's one kind of peace in life where a person has no pressure, has no anxiety. There is no deadlines. The person has retired. The person has already graduated. All of his kids grew up. There's no headaches. There's no bills. There's no tuition. There's no mortgage. There's nothing to deal with. So, Machaya, you relax. You sit on your couch and you chill. So you say, I'm peaceful. I have tranquility. I have serenity in life. Then you have another kind of person who is bombarded a whole day. Millions of things, texts, emails, deadlines, engagements, all kinds of things, bills upon bills, and you're going meshuggah. But nevertheless, you're able to, in all of that chaos and all the turmoil, you find in there some measure of stability. You find a certain peacefulness in all of that. They tell the story of the king who once requested that someone should paint a beautiful picture which will depict a calmness and a peacefulness, that whenever he will look at that picture, at that portrait, it will instill within him a sense of tranquility. And they had all these artists and painters. They were painting away all these beautiful images and scenery. And finally, when the king looks at all these pictures and all these portraits that the artist drew, he was able to narrow it down to two. One was a portrait of a very beautiful landscape. There was a lake that was calm and still, beautiful turquoise water, and above there was a blue sky with nice white fluffy clouds. Very, very calm, very, very serene. Then there was a second picture which had these big, bare, rugged mountains, and the skies were dark, lightning and thunder. There was this waterfall nearby that was just foaming and just raging. But then the king was able to see in the corner, near the waterfall, in that rugged mountain, was a little crack. And in that crack there was a little bush. And in that bush there was a bird in her nest, resting very, very calmly. And the king, which picture do you think the king chose? The king chose the second picture. The king said, to be calm and to be relaxed is not just in an absence and in a vacuum of any pressures, you're just calm. Rather, to be calm, the true calmness, true peace, is when you have all this chaos. Look at this bird. There's so much going on. And yet, it is able to carve out a peacefulness. It's still, it's serene. That is what will really calm me down. And this is what Hashem is teaching us, a very, very powerful lesson. And that is, if we think that, when will I be able to study my Torah? When will I be able to pray and do what I need to do? I need to wait to the time that everything is calm and relaxed in my life. I don't get nagging from my friends, from my family, and I don't have any pressures. They'll all grow up, everyone will be out of the house, we'll be an empty nester, and then I'll be able to deal with all the issues, and I'll be calm and relaxed, and I'll be perfect. It doesn't work that way. It is when we're able to, in all of the pressures and anxieties of life, to be able to create that space, because we know that we are anchored in the source of all permanency, of all calmness, of all stability. We are connected to Hashem, and no matter what happens to us, nothing can shake that. So it is important to realize this distinction, because we know that sometimes in life, when we are not tested, when we are not tried, it doesn't necessarily bring out that greatness that we have. The Rambam talks about the difference between a tzaddik and a Baal Tshuva. A tzaddik who has never tasted the taste of sin, has never sinned, never had a negative thought. A Baal Tshuva, somebody who has tasted what non-kosher tastes like, or other non-kosher activities. And that person, when they encounter that, they do teshuvah, and then they encounter that challenge again, and they abstain, they refrain, then we know the person has really, really changed. The tzaddik, we don't know. The person has never been tried, never been tested. The whole concept of nisayon, the fact that Hashem tests us and challenges us in life, is, according to one of the explanations, for our benefit, to bring out a greatness, to bring out a depth, a power that we didn't realize, we didn't know about until that point. And when we go through that challenge, and when we go through that test, we realize, wow, there's a strength, there's a depth that was undiscovered until this point. And therefore, the Baal Tshuva, we have that confidence. We know that if he's able to overcome that, then nothing can stand in their way. In the same way, when we go through the challenges of life, if we have no challenges, we don't know if your calmness is just a default position, or it's just a condition that you have because it's not tested, it's unchallenged, it's uncontested. However, in the instance when you go through all the turmoil and all the anxiety and all the pressures, and nevertheless you remain calm, you know this is a calmness. You know this is a stability that can never be destroyed. It is much more, it's stronger, it's much more powerful than anything in the world. There was a chassid who came to his teacher, his Rebbe, the Ruzhner Rebbe, and he said, Rebbe, I want to study Torah, I want to learn, I want to pray, but I have no time. I have no mental space for it. I have no patience. I have so many deadlines, I have so many things going on. I can't study Torah. I can't learn. It's too hard. So the Rebbe said, in the Pirkei Avos, our sages tell us, Al Tomar, you should not say, L'cheshe efne eshne, when I get the time, eshna, I will learn. Shema lo sipana, perhaps, maybe, you will never have the opportunity. So Shema lo sipana means maybe you will not be able to learn because you won't have the time. But the Rebbe, in a new twist of an interpretation, he says what the Chachamim are telling us, don't say, L'cheshe efne eshne, when I have the time, I will learn. Shema, maybe what Hashem wants from you is lo tipana, to study when you don't have time. In other words, why do you think that Hashem wants you to reach a stage in life where all of the pressures will go away and all of your worries and all of the things that take up all of the mental space that you have in life, and then you'll say, now I'll learn. Maybe that's not what Hashem wants from you. Maybe Hashem wants, in all of that, and all the commotion, it is there, in all the challenges and doubts that you have in life, it is there that you should study. Maybe that's what he desires. Maybe that is more precious to him. And this is an important lesson for all of us, because what Zvulun is teaching us, that, he may have been that businessman who had no time, you would say. Always on the run, always going places. But Hashem says that is Zavul. This is the permanent dwelling place. When you're able to reach deep within yourself and realize who controls everything, who is running the world, And you're able to instill within all of that, you carve out a time to study Torah. You create the opportunity to do a mitzvah. You look at every opportunity that you encounter and you find the blessing, the good in that situation, the hashgacha pratis, the divine providence in that. It is then you have unlocked in that space and in that place the purpose of it all. That is true peace. That is true tranquility. That is permanency. You have created in the world of instability, of chaos, you've created that relaxation. And especially in times that we're living in now, where there's a lot of questions, there's a lot of uncertainty. And we say, you know what, let's just get through this time. Let's just, there's vaccines, there's some positive things. Let's just survive the next few months, and then things will get back to normal. But perhaps, as the Ruzhner Rebbe said, maybe Hashem doesn't want us to wait till things get better, till things improve. Perhaps we have to look in the raging storm, in all of the uncertainty that we're dealing with, to find that tranquility, to have that little nest and create a calmness, to be able to, as the Alter Rebbe would say about the Baalei Esek, the people who study and who work in business the whole week. He says, the whole week you work, but on Shabbos, you should spend time to study Torah and daven ba'arichos at a lengthier pace, for a lengthier period of time, at a slower pace. And he says this is important for the businessmen, even more so than those who study Torah. Because the whole week, we don't know. This person's studying, and this person is working. But what is this person who's working, what is he really doing it for? If on Shabbos, when you can no longer work, you revert to a person who studies, a person who prays at length, so that indicates to us that the entire week, while you were busy running around, you were really doing it for a higher purpose. You were unleashing that potential, that all of the chaos and all of the turmoil, all the pressures that you dealt with throughout the week, it never really got to you. Because on Shabbos, you have revealed your true essence. You slow the pace, you daven with kavana, you learn something. That indicates that what you went through the entire week was actually revealing your great potential. And that's why it's important for those who are engaged, who are not studying in kollel the entire day, to have a kvias, itim laTorah, to have a special set-aside time to study Torah. But as the Rebbe would say, not just kvias, setting a fixed time during the day. It's kvias benefesh. When you find a time to study, the phone is not ringing, the texts are not coming, the emails, nothing exists. The whole world disappears because it may be just for 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes are entirely for Hashem. There's nothing else. Because now what has happened here is you have shown that no matter what you're dealing with, no matter what the challenges are at that time, Zavulun, it's based Zavul. You're saying, in this little space, I have created a permanent dwelling for Hashem. And that's what Hashem really wants. He could have had his dwelling place in the spiritual realms. There's no challenges, there's no evil, there's nothing. There's just goodness, there's just holiness. He didn't want that. He wanted here in this world. He wanted, with all of the negativity and all of the challenges that we deal with, it is here he finds that space that he calls home, that he calls permanent, that he calls his. And when we connect to that, we unleash something that is really, really special. So my blessing to each and every one of us is, as we go into the week, and everyone dealing with what they have to deal with in life, and we should all hear positive and good news and health for each and every one of us. Let us all take a cue from Zevulun. Don't think that just because the majority of our time is preoccupied with things that don't seem to be directly connected to Torah. Just like Yaakov Avinu. For 20 years, he was chasing sheep and protecting them. But he was able to take all of that and turn that into a tremendous opportunity to be so successful, to raise his Shvatim, the foundation of the Jewish people. May we all hear good news. May we all, each and every one of us, find peace, find tranquility, find calmness in everything that we do. May we merit to the coming of Mashiach, B'mher of Yameinu, Amen.